this video is part 4 of a 5-part series in which I examine Shadow Weaver's arc with a critical eye. If you have not seen the previous 3 parts, they're very important to understanding my full analysis. Also, as I have warned in the videos before, this video is heavy discussion of suicidal ideation and abuse because the show made certain creative choices that I wish to discuss. If you are in danger of taking your own life, please call this number and tell them what's going on. You need to take care of yourself. Alright, on with the video! And so, we arrive at what I consider to be one of the worst written character arcs in all the stories I've consumed. I warned in the first part of this series that this sequence of videos is extremely critical, but here I will warn again. Most people are not in the same camp as I am on this issue. Plenty of people enjoyed the season, and look, I respect that wholeheartedly. If it meant something to you, I am not going to sit here and judge you for your differing opinion, just as I would expect you not to judge me for mine. That being said, I will not have many kind words in this part. I can count on one hand the moments I actually thought worked, and there were more moments that would have rocked if not for the context. But most of the season concerning Shadow Weaver is just plain bad to me. Today, I'm going to be discussing why in heavy detail. If you get offended by people sticking up for villains or are a sensitive person, I would suggest finding a different video to watch now, because I'm going to be harsher than ever in this part. With that being said, let's begin the strange rabbit trail of the conclusion to Shadow Weaver's arc, the first episode of Season 5. Shadow Weaver plays a relatively minor role in Horde Prime, only appearing in a couple scenes, but because I need to be fair, I'll mention it anyway. The first time we see her, she's arguing with Micah about using the heart of Etheria. The two of them are very hostile toward one another and even interact physically, Shadow Weaver pressing his chest and Micah smacking her hand away. This was expected, of course, since Micah was hostile to her in Season 4, but as I'll mention after this part, they took it way too far. Skipping ahead, there is one moment that I unironically like in and of itself, and it's the moment when Shadow Weaver saves Micah's life. They somewhat ruin it with the "you're welcome" comment, but in Shadow Weaver's defense, Micah didn't thank her. Still, I appreciate the show, albeit begrudgingly, acknowledging she does care about him. So what's the problem, you might ask? Well, the argument between Shadow Weaver and Micah is, after Season 4, I wasn't expecting sunshine and rainbows between them, particularly since I basically always assumed Micah was aware she had joined the Horde and betrayed everyone. But what I was not expecting was for the writers to backtrack on Shadow Weaver's earlier position to not use the heart of Etheria. Number 1, that wasn't her original plan. She had suggested to bring the stolen magic back to aid the princesses in the war. Number 2, she knew that using it would destroy the planet. Shadow Weaver, no matter what you might say about her and her lust for power, didn't want Etheria to be destroyed. She was always bent on conquest, not destruction, and after she joined the rebellion, she actively worked to stop Catra from setting off the portal. You could argue she just wanted to spite Catra, but I think it's intellectually dishonest to assume that's the only reason why. Thus, the whole thing with her insulting Micah in an attempt to get him to use the heart is an intentional twisting of her prior motives and her intelligence, which was set up before to be very high. The other major problem is one that I didn't know where to include, but I figured I'd mention it here since it deals with Shadow Weaver and Micah's relationship. After Season 4, I was expecting more backstory between them, perhaps about how Micah was exiled, how they became enemies, etc. The ending of Light Spinner just wasn't enough to convince me that Micah hated her or was even angry at her, just distraught. But in Season 5, he's apparently so angry at her that it can be safely assumed he doesn't love her anymore, not a single bit. Putting aside the fact that this is too harsh and they needed to explore it properly, the show never offers or hints at any sort of reconciliation for Shadow Weaver and Micah. This was a very poor writing decision in my opinion. Whether or not you believe that Shadow Weaver groomed Micah the whole time or even manipulated him at all, you have to accept that she cared about him to some extent. This care automatically warrants more development and explanation, no questions asked. If they didn't want to delve into Shadow Weaver's complexities, they shouldn't have dedicated an entire episode to her showing her nuances. They needed to flesh out the relationship between her and Micah, and they just didn't feel like it. Heck, there's only one reference to any sort of exploration later on, and it's so vague that you'll miss it if you didn't pay attention to the creator's quotes, which I'll touch on when we get to the corresponding episodes. Shadow Weaver doesn't appear for 6 more episodes, and this is a problem in and of itself to me. She's an incredibly major character throughout the show, on par of importance with Hordak, in fact. And the fact that they utterly refuse to even touch on what she's been up to is straight up bad storytelling. As I mentioned before, you set up an arc for her in season 3. You need to stick to that arc. If you don't stick to it, your character's story will mean nothing to the audience. I understand that this is partially due to the rushed nature of season 5 in general, which I'll discuss in the next video, but it's not completely for that reason. Season 4 had good pacing, and they could have done everything they should have with Shadow Weaver in that arc and more, but they just didn't wanna. And that is an extreme bother to me as a writer. But I'll move on. Shadow Weaver's next episode of relevance is in the episode Shot in the Dark. For reference, Micah has just been chipped, and Shadow Weaver appeals to Casta Spella for help in saving him. In the woods, she tells Casta that she has the idea to shut down the heart of Etheria, making the sorcerers strong enough to stand against Horde Prime's forces. This part is clearly meant to be a misdirect when read on its own. You think that Shadow Weaver is just trying to repeat the spell of obtainment, but in reality, she genuinely wants to save Micah, a fact that she admits to Casta Spella full force with another plea. If Shadow Weaver tries to take the power for herself, Casta needs to stop her. According to Noelle Stevenson in an Entertainment Weekly interview, Micah's return was not originally planned, but now looking back, it's impossible for me to imagine it any other way. He first appears in that dream world at the end of season 3. When it starts falling apart and he's about to disappear, Angela assumes he's part of the portal, but he has a line that gets cut short and covered by noise. "Angela, I'm not..." That was written by Josie Campbell, our story director, so I never questioned that line. I just thought it was something like, "I'm not ready to go." So then we got to record with Micah's voice actor, and Josie's like, "I think you should really finish the line." I'm like, "Finish the line?" And she says, "The full line is, 'I'm not dead.'" I'm like, "Wait, what?" So she does it, and of course that's the best read of the line, so I'm like, well, F you, I guess Micah's alive now. It's one of my favorite stories because making a show is so chaotic. Even though I think I have a firm grasp on what's going to happen, I really do love it when something like that happens. Like, okay, we all kind of assumed Micah's not coming back, but what happens if he does? What does he bring to this narrative? What color does he bring out of other characters? I'm hesitant to bring back dead characters, referring to Micah, just because death has to mean something, but he was a character I feel like we really needed. He's all that's left of Glimmer's family and supplies a moral compass for Shadow Weaver. It seems like maybe he was the one character whose opinion she actually did care about. Micah is really instrumental in that because he's the last remnant of this person she used to be, who was still selfish and manipulative, but had dreams for her life where she was on the side of good and people liked her. I think that's what brings her to that moment when she finally makes a sacrifice for someone else. Why do I bring up this quote? Because I think that the intent and actual reality of the situation here are very different. Besides the failsafe episode making her sincerity in this scene unclear in the show's full context, something I'll discuss in more detail later, this fact is not clear in her sacrifice. I'm mentioning this now because I have too much to go over after her death, but Noelle is trying to awkwardly explain how to bring Micah back without really having him play too much of a role in the lives of the other characters. Despite what she says, it's never made clear whether Shadow Weaver sacrificed herself for him, or even sacrificed herself at all, really, especially given other quotes from the showrunner. All we have is what the show presents to us, which is a hollow, half-hearted attempt to give Micah's return some relevance to anyone. Some people are going to argue that Micah's return was supposed to simply raise the stakes, but with all the respect I can muster, that just doesn't work. Bringing a character back from the dead to raise the stakes is something that can work under specific circumstances where it won't feel cheap or meaningless. However, there's only one problem. She-Ra's magic system is too vague and undefined to really explain and set solid stakes for Micah's return and subsequent shipping. While I personally prefer hard magic systems, She-Ra's magic system works for what it's trying to do, and yet the show forces a trope that just doesn't work with it. Let's discuss a counterexample. In the Stormlight Archive, one of my favorite book series, surge binding is very easily defined. The Knights Radiant have 10 orders with 2 surges or powers for each one. These powers were so serious that they led to the destruction of their previous planet until Honor bound the humans with oaths of, you guessed it, honor, to control their power. And yet, the minions of the evil god Odium, the Fused, also have radiant powers. They return from the dead and seriously screw things up for the Radiants because they have the same clearly defined set-up powers. Worse, in some ways, they are quantifiably more powerful than the Radiants. This creates a feeling of thrill every time a Radiant-Fused battle takes place, who will win not just in this fight, but in the overall war. These are questions that make perfect sense within a magic system where power is easily quantified. However, She-Ra's magic system is not. Micah being more powerful than Shadow Weaver is relevant to their characters because we can trust Shadow Weaver's reaction that she's jealous of his greater abilities. However, when it comes to raising the stakes as the enemy, we the audience don't see it for ourselves due to the vague rules, and the characters' reactions without any sort of clear emotional depth aren't enough to truly keep us on the edge of our seats. Again, I am not saying that She-Ra's magic system is bad in and of itself, but certain confines do exist within the world-building model you've chosen. In summary, the argument of Micah coming back just to raise the stakes doesn't work particularly all that well. And even if it did, characters coming back from the dead, especially characters who have connections to other members of the main cast, need to mean something on a major emotional level. Shadow Weaver shows emotion when Micah returns. I'm not denying that one bit. However, it's never really explored. They don't come back to how she obviously missed him in her cell, nor do they have her wrestle with the fact that the one person she truly loved has returned and she's been gorging herself on power when she thought he was dead all this time. No. Because Shadow Weaver does not deserve that nuance, and since she has crossed the arbitrary line of morality the writers set up for her, she doesn't get to truly struggle to become good again the way Catra did. They could have had her struggle, and in many ways it feels like she was meant to, and yet they just didn't feel like it, and that is a massive shame. The next 2 episodes skip Shadow Weaver's development again for Spinnerella and Natasa, characters who are not nearly as important to the story, but the writers felt they had to cram down our throats every step of the way. So let's discuss the one episode in all of She-Ra that I truly, deeply hate. The failsafe episode. To summarize for the first scene, Shadow Weaver and Castaspella present their discovery to the group that the way to shut down the heart of Etheria is to find the failsafe that is hidden in Mysticor. They have to retrieve it in a stealth mission and bring it back in order to stop the heart. During this scene, there's enmity between Shadow Weaver and Catra until Catra begrudgingly agrees to go with Adora and the others to make sure Shadow Weaver doesn't try anything shady. There's a few things I want to comment on. First, I know that Shadow Weaver being a manipulative jerk to Catra and Adora in this episode is expected, seeing as how she has remained pretty much a static character throughout the latter half of the show. Thus, I'm not going to call what she does in this episode out of character. However, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that the interactions in this episode do feel out of place. Whether it's because Shadow Weaver wasn't really in their lives in Season 4, or because I personally read her as sincere in the Whispering Woods, or a combination of both, it felt incredibly strange going in. I used to get bullied online because I drew Shadow Weaver pictures of her and Micah that could be seen as romantic if you weren't aware that I'm autistic, and thus I literally do not understand the difference between romantic and platonic affection. But after seeing the show, I was shocked by one detail. Shadow Weaver is touchy-feely with Adora to a creepy degree in this level, almost to the point of it being inappropriate for their relationship. Shadow Weaver has always been very affectionate with the girls, but especially Adora, in order to manipulate them. However, this crosses a line for her character, a big one. There are moments of her touching Adora's stomach, caressing her face, and just being extremely handsy with her all from behind, which, if I understand correctly from my research, is considered a romantic cue. I can't fathom this creative choice other than to say that this is the writers trying to force us to forget seasons 2 through 4, going back to season 1 and doubling down on it as hard as they possibly can, when it just doesn't work. Here's a pro tip for any newbie writers. Do not, and I mean do not, repeat this mistake. Whether it's from not understanding romantic cues, and if this is you, you're not alone and you don't need to feel embarrassed, or from knowingly wanting to make your character handsy, unless you want your character to be a child sex predator, make sure that your false affection cues won't be misconstrued that way. And if you do intend for that to be the case, here are 2 pieces of advice. 1, don't rate your freaking show as Y7. 2, set it up clearly and undeniably earlier on, as mentioned before. I'm not saying that they intended Shadow Weaver to be a child sex predator, but it at least looks like they wanted her to be handsy far beyond what was appropriate. Not Bill Cosby handsy, but maybe President Biden handsy. And please, no politics. I don't want to go down that hellhole, please and thank you. There's a scene I want to touch on before we get to the failsafe mission, and that's this one bit in the corridor. Basically, the gist of it is that Casta tells the story of the deep magic within Etheria and how sorcerers tried to obtain it before with terrible results. This is obviously a reference to the spell of obtainment, which she uses as a passive-aggressive remark against Shadow Weaver. Shadow Weaver admits that it was a mistake and says she doesn't understand why it keeps getting brought up, and Casta snaps that Shadow Weaver, quote, roped her brother into her twisted dark magic when he was only a child, and that she could have killed him. Shadow Weaver retorts that it would have worked had he not run away, once again blaming him for the failure, and making a snide remark at Casta before they continue on their way. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, because if I stop the show every time one of these moments comes up, we would be here all day. But just real quick, what the hell? I know that the showrunner says that Shadow Weaver manipulated Micah, as I mentioned in the previous quote. She even goes so far as to say in another quote that she ruined Micah's life. However, as I mentioned in part 2, this is just not clear. It's a huge stretch, especially to say that Lightspinner groomed Micah the entire time, and yet this is the retconning Season 5 has chosen to do. Again, it throws all the nuance and care done in the Lightspinner episode out the window in favor of portraying Shadow Weaver as easier to hate and harder to redeem. This is so they can later throw up their hands and say, well, we just couldn't do it, when it was their foolish decisions that caused everyone to hate her in the first place. The next scene comes when Shadow Weaver and Adora are walking down the fire corridor on their way to the failsafe room. I'll do my best to summarize the speech of Shadow Weaver's because it confused me a bit at first and I had to watch it several times before I really understood what she was saying. Shadow Weaver's basic assertion is this: Adora can't transform into She-Ra, something that we know to be true from prior episodes. She argues that this is because Adora is still struggling with complicated feelings toward Catra. Therefore, Adora should distance herself from Catra and focus on protecting her instead so she can save the world. She makes the case that Adora can't afford not to do this because there is too much at stake. There's a lot to unpack in this scene. I'm going to do my best to explain where I think Shadow Weaver is right, where she's wrong, and what I think her motives could have been with this scene. First, let's discuss where she's right, something that a lot of people don't want to admit. Shadow Weaver is correct that without Adora, the world will not survive. This is shown to be true when Adora nearly dies trying to stop the heart later on. She is also correct that Adora is struggling with complicated feelings toward Catra, but this is presumably because Adora is, 1, trying to forgive Catra when she had just abused her and tried to kill her before, and 2, dealing with changing feelings as she starts to see Catra as more than just a friend. However, Shadow Weaver is obviously proven wrong in her solution to the problem when she asks Adora to distance herself from Catra. Of course, we don't really see Adora work through her feelings toward Catra even in the end because the show just assumes she forgives her, but if I went down that rabbit hole of the problems I had with Catra and Adora's relationship arc, we'd be here legitimately till the end of time, so let's talk about Shadow Weaver's motives after we examine the next scene. In the next scene, Adora accesses the failsafe. Shadow Weaver skirts around the question of whether absorbing the magic into one's body and deploying it is safe. That is, until Catra forces her to admit something crucial that was left out. Whoever absorbs the failsafe must take the brunt of the full magic of Etheria into their own body. Nobody is strong enough to do it without dying except for She-Ra. The Alliance reacts with anger, saying that Shadow Weaver just wants to sacrifice Adora for her own personal gain, but Adora stops them and says she'll do it. This is framed as another aspect of Adora's tendency to fall on her own sword for others, a mindset ingrained in her by Shadow Weaver. She takes that failsafe and then Micah and other sorcerers attack. Now, I see several problems with this entire situation, so bear with me here. This scene is the epitome of the ambiguous nature of Shadow Weaver's entire backstory, which is why I detest this episode so much. The show utterly refuses to take a firm stance on Shadow Weaver's motives here. Did she want to save Micah? Did she want the power for herself? Honestly, I see the argument for both sides, and I tend to lean more toward the latter situation in terms of what is clear in the show. So let's discuss both sides of the debate, and then I'll explain why what I see as the intended version is such a ridiculous route for her character. First, let's look at the best case scenario. Some people will argue that Shadow Weaver was truly trying to help Adora transform into She-Ra so that she could withstand the power without dying in the fire corridor. The explanation they give for why she hides this information is because she's not trusted by the rebellion, and they would obviously react in a poor manner to her if she told them the full plan. If Adora becomes She-Ra, there's no risk of her dying, so why tell them she could die to begin with? While misguided, this would stay consistent with the Light Spinner episode, where Light Spinner kept the truth from Micah not out of malice, but out of indifference. No need to discuss failure if you're going to succeed, right? The problem with this idea, however, is that it's not clear this is why Shadow Weaver kept the truth from Adora. It's a nice theory, I really wish it was true, and it's certainly more consistent with Shadow Weaver's character, but it's not supported clearly by the show. Additionally, the framing does not favor this interpretation, as Shadow Weaver doesn't offer any of these reasons in her defense. You can make up reasons why she didn't defend herself, but no actual explanation is given. The other side will argue that Shadow Weaver knew her advice was faulty and gave it to Adora on purpose, hoping to kill her with the power so there would be no one left to stop her from taking it for herself. This is supported by the fact that she's not an idiot. She knows that Adora and Catra are better off together, as seen in the final scene, and that she hid the information from the Alliance about her death, prompting them to erupt in anger. The show also very obviously frames the Alliance as correct and Shadow Weaver as wrong for proposing this plan, and thus I believe that despite some counter-arguments that could be given, I believe this is what was intended. And I hate it. There are gaping massive problems with this route in the story. Let's talk about the first one. Shadow Weaver almost always says what she believes to be true. Thus, in the corridor, it is reasonable based on prior knowledge to believe that she gave that advice to Adora sincerely, trying to help her save the world. Her straight up lying when she knows Adora and Catra are better off together for their own well-being doesn't make sense with what was previously established. Also, as much as the fandom doesn't like to admit it, Shadow Weaver is correct that Adora is the only one who can stop Horde Prime. She's the most powerful magically, she has the best chance of surviving, and magic is Horde Prime's weakness, pure and simple. People who say she was 100% wrong in the corridor ignore this fact because the show wants you to forget it. They want you to forget that yes, Shadow Weaver can in fact be correct sometimes. The second major problem with this idea is that Shadow Weaver is a straight-up idiot with a so-called plan to take the power for herself. Let's think about this for a moment, shall we? We know that sorcerers in She-Ra can channel lesser power through magic that isn't connected to a runestone, which would be true for the heart of Etheria. This is supported by the Light Spinner episode. Light Spinner straight up says it. If the power was released, everyone would get an upgrade in terms of being more powerful. Shadow Weaver, without outside sources of power, is on the lower end of talent and power in terms of magic. Therefore, if the magic is released, she would be at equal power with the other sorcerers at most. The princesses would still be more powerful than her, and if she tried anything evil with the power, they would be there to stop her, not to mention Castaspella, whom Shadow Weaver explicitly told to stop her in a previous episode. Finally, there's the fact that Shadow Weaver would not sacrifice Adora's life, in my opinion. I think abusers can love their victims, and Shadow Weaver sincerely thought she was doing what was best for everyone involved while she hurt both the girls. I know the show doesn't frame it that way, and so it isn't very important to me whether Shadow Weaver loved or thought she loved or didn't love both the girls or whatever. She was an abuser, abuse is wrong, period. No questions asked. However, regardless of whether you think Shadow Weaver truly loved the girls or not, she did care about Adora. Not for her well-being, maybe, but for her life at least. She never attempted to kill her. At most, she wanted Adora to come back to the fright zone so she could be controlled again. She raised Adora from infancy, and Adora said she taught her how to read and tie her boots. Shadow Weaver, regardless of how much sympathy you frame around her abuse, was attached to Adora. I cannot see a universe in which she would knowingly slaughter Adora on the altar of power. This makes all the previous seasons meaningless. Why would Shadow Weaver relentlessly hunt Adora in Season 1 if she just wanted to kill her? Why would she join the rebellion and try to save her from the portal? Why would she avoid betraying her in Season 4 even when it would have been simple without a hint of this later plan to sacrifice her? Everything from before is tossed out the window in favor of us hating Shadow Weaver, and the writers force this with every fiber of their being, even when it is like trying to put a camel through the eye of a needle. Does it matter if it's out of character? Not a single iota. We decided that Shadow Weaver is evil. Evil people don't change. They don't love anyone, and none of their relationships are allowed to stay nuanced. If we don't like her, we will make sure the audience knows it, even if it sabotages her entire arc in the process. Whew, I really am going on this arc hard, am I? Afterward, Micah and the other sorcerers attack. The only note of relevance is that he accuses Shadow Weaver of teaching him dark magic, which requires the most negative reading of the Light Spinner episode to make any sense at all, but I already talked about that before. After this scene, Catra is very upset that Adora chose to go along with Shadow Weaver's plan. The two of them argue, and Catra eventually leaves, rendering Adora alone. When she goes back to the rebellion's hideout, Shadow Weaver tries to reassure her that she made the right choice and that Catra has never understood the concept of sacrificing oneself for the greater good. Adora snaps back that she will never forgive Shadow Weaver, that she ruins everyone and any chance they ever had to be happy. Shadow Weaver tries to justify what she said in the fire corridor, but Adora tells her basically that she's lying to herself, and she says she'll do everything she can to make sure Shadow Weaver never gets her hands on the power. During this scene, Shadow Weaver looks freaked out, and Adora chooses to leave her alone as she goes inside the cave. There is an enormous problem I have with this speech. Some people are going to argue with me and say I'm victim blaming or whatever, but I think this disconnect has to do with the definition of forgiveness. When many people say victims don't have to forgive their abusers, what they mean is victims don't have to reconcile with their abusers and stay a part of their lives. I would say that this is true if we're talking about this definition of forgiveness. I'm on the fence about whether Adora could have reconciled with Shadow Weaver in the show had things gone differently, but ultimately that is her choice to make. Yes, it's often wise to flee a bad situation even if there is true repentance involved, which there wasn't in this scenario. However, when I discuss forgiveness, I'm referring to the Christian definition of the word. I'm not trying to force my religion onto the show or you guys, and I'm not here to preach as I'm not a pastor. In short, biblical forgiveness is simply allowing yourself to heal and not hang on to anger toward people who have hurt you, regardless of whether they apologize or not. This is a very healthy practice to do regardless of religion, and even if you don't see it as a moral obligation as I do, it has many physical and mental health benefits and ultimately has been said to lead to greater happiness. Why do I bring up these differing definitions? Because it's important to clearly define our terms. According to her in a comic book interview, I think that Shadow Weaver's sacrifice is a little bit less about her character getting redeemed, because I think that's another message of this season especially, is that redemption is not just one good act and dying, and forgiveness is not a given. It's something you have to work for. Putting aside the ethics of this whole thing, which will differ based on your worldview, it is markedly unhealthy for Shadow Weaver not to forgive Shadow Weaver. This is a medical fact. It's okay if she's still working toward forgiveness or isn't ready yet. Something like that takes a lot of time. But the show doesn't mention any of this at all, instead opting to have Adora stay bitter and angry toward Shadow Weaver as far as we know until the very last minute of the show. This is supported by Noelle's quote in another interview that Adora and Catra no longer love Shadow Weaver. I probably wouldn't be pointing this out so much if it wasn't obvious that Adora has forgiven Catra, who has done everything Shadow Weaver did and worse. It's incredibly unfair to Shadow Weaver's character when, again, Catra gets the easy way out and she doesn't. I'm going to discuss this bias more in the next video, but yeah, not a good look. Along these same lines, the idea that Shadow Weaver always ruins people all the time is not correct, but I've already discussed that before, and in order not to sound like a broken record, I'll move on. In the next episode, we get several clues that Adora's speech is what made Shadow Weaver realize she was being a turd the whole time. How or why, I don't know, but at this point I've gotten used to their utter refusal to show Shadow Weaver's point of view in the show, so whatever. The next important scene comes when Catra realizes that Horde Prime has hacked Etheria and is trying to access the heart. She races back to warn Adora of the danger so she can stop the heart from activating, but she finds Shadow Weaver there, drunk. Shadow Weaver gloats that Adora has already left and accuses Catra of being selfish for supposedly trying to stop her. Catra grabs Shadow Weaver roughly by the collar and commands her to stop angrily. Just a side note, this would be a mark of evil and violence on Catra's part if it were done to literally any other character, but since it's Shadow Weaver, it's okay, right? Anyway, Shadow Weaver and Catra listen to Horde Prime's speech, and Catra demands that Shadow Weaver take her to the Fright Zone. Shadow Weaver mentions that Adora is too far away for them to get there, but this is framed as her making excuses by the show. Catra snaps at her to do something good with her power for once, and Shadow Weaver reluctantly obliges. They go, and Shadow Weaver collapses against the wall, fatigued from the large transport to the Heart Corridor. All I really have to say on this scene is that the show once again is intellectually dishonest with its audience. Shadow Weaver is known to have subpar talent and power in magic, and this was a major part of her arc in previous seasons. In fact, she still is shown to be this way in this scene. But the show frames it as her being selfish for not wanting to put her neck on the line to get them there. I'm not saying they shouldn't have gone, but I once again can't stand by and not comment on the fact that the show utterly insists on villainizing her beyond what is appropriate. And here we come to the scene that broke me. I'm going to admit to my bias and say that this scene caused an actual mental breakdown after I watch it. You can blame my autism for that. Shadow Weaver and Catra arrive to help Adora, and Shadow Weaver takes charge of leading Adora to the heart, while Catra fights the monster that Horde Prime sent to destroy She-Ra. While on the way, Shadow Weaver is tempted to take the power for herself, yet at hearing Catra scream and how Adora races to her aid despite her injuries, Shadow Weaver snaps out of her haze and goes to help Catra. She fights the monster, giving Catra time to escape to get Adora to the heart. Catra begs her to save her life, but Shadow Weaver says it's too late for her, and she tells Catra she's proud of her, presumably for being a better person than she could ever hope to be. Adora manages to find them as Shadow Weaver takes off her mask, smiling sadly at them with a "you're welcome," before blowing herself up to destroy the monster. And that is where my scene-by-scene analysis ends. Okay, so let's talk about Shadow Weaver's death. I'm going to first address the issues the show itself presents, and then I'll talk about possible counter-interpretations to this scene. The obvious one, this is redemption by death. If you're unaware, redemption by death is a trope in which a villain does one good act before sacrificing themselves to save the world or the main character or whatever. It began with Darth Vader and has since become what many writers consider to be a straight-up cliché. I don't personally fall into this camp as it's a trope like any trope is, but I have a much bigger problem with it, and that's that this trope, cliché, whatchamacallit, glorifies suicide. Shadow Weaver committed suicide pure and simple. She was undeniably shaken by all she was and all she had done, and she had no support group. There was no one there to show her a better way, to befriend her in spite of her evil and see her as an actual person, similarly to Catra. She had no chance offered at redemption beyond Adora's healing, which pales in comparison to her "I'll never forgive you, you just ruined people" speech later on. Furthermore, she was clearly suicidal in the Light Spinner episode 2, and to those who are saying it was a sacrifice and not a suicide, I have 3 counters to that. First off, suicides and sacrifices are not mutually exclusive. This is a fact. Secondly, saying that it was a sacrifice instead of a suicide is like denying that Shara from Undertale committed suicide, even though she literally poisoned herself with buttercups. It was a sacrifice, but it was a suicide nonetheless. Finally, Shadow Weaver refused to save herself when she obviously, clearly, truly, undeniably could have, saying that it was too late for her. If that doesn't sound like a suicide committed out of guilt, self-hatred, and shame, I don't know what is. The worst part about how She-Ra ultimately ends up glorifying suicide, however, is the inconsistency. Here are a few of them. Why is Adora worth more than what she can give to other people, but Shadow Weaver isn't? Why is one's innate worth as a human being determined by their actions? Why does Adora survive the impossible through the power of love, but Shadow Weaver doesn't get to? Why does Catra have people relentlessly pursuing her, begging her to change, going to the ends of the earth for her, but Shadow Weaver doesn't? And most of all, why in the name of the flying spaghetti monster would Adora and Catra literally have amnesia after Shadow Weaver dies? I mean, seriously, they're making out less than an hour after their mother figure died in front of them. There's no recognition for her sacrifice. There's no mention of her to Micah or Castor or anyone else. There's nothing. As soon as Shadow Weaver died, she became non-existent to everyone who had cared about her before, and everyone she cared about in return. She died in self-hatred, a person whom the show believes is wholly and completely unlovable. Some of you may be thinking that I'm getting a bit too extreme in my analysis. After all, Noelle doesn't condone Shadow Weaver's death, so why would the show? Well, the first thing is that author's intent and what is presented are not always in alignment, as we see here. Regardless of her saying Shadow Weaver committed suicide out of spite, which is a real thing, I'm not denying that, it doesn't look that way. The "you're welcome" is the only evidence people have to go on, and that ignores the entirety of the last 2 episodes. But in case you're still not convinced, here are some quotes from Noelle. In a Collider interview, Noelle Stevenson said, "I think for Adora and Catra, they've had such a toxic relationship with Shadow Weaver, and she has, messed them up so deeply for years. And it's something that I think is going to be a little controversial, but I really don't consider Shadow Weaver as having been redeemed, even though she sort of goes out on this one good action. I don't think that erased everything that she did to these 2 people, but I think that she gave them what they needed to move forward and to continue their lives without her in it, which I felt we needed to do that in a way that was somewhat affirming for both of them." She further expands on this in a Gizmodo interview where she says that Adora and Catra, the 3 of them can't be in a room together, it just won't work, but their relationship isn't something they can all pretend isn't real. So that moment of sacrifice, I think part of was still selfish because she's operating on the idea that they have to forgive Shadow Weaver because she's doing this noble thing. It brings everything full circle, and I don't think that either Catra or Adora would have been satisfied if things didn't go down the way they did. It had to come to a head like that, and Adora and Catra finally had to talk about what Shadow Weaver did to them, and creating that space for it was Shadow Weaver's last gift to them, whether or not her intentions were pure, because they deeply needed to leave her in the past and move forward together. And wow, what an absolutely disgusting take on the whole situation. Shadow Weaver's death was a gift to her children. What in the actual hell? I apologize for getting worked up, but as someone who has struggled with self-hatred and suicidal ideation myself for many years, this is disgusting. Gross. So gross. But at the risk of sounding again like a broken record, I will move on and discuss a common counter-argument I see. Many people will argue that Shadow Weaver's suicide was spiteful and cruel, and she went out purposely, intentionally traumatizing Catra and Adora. I've already discussed how the tone, music, Shadow Weaver's tone of voice, and dialogue mostly don't communicate that, but even if this was true in the show, that is one crappy way to end her arc. Think about it. You are a villain. You go out evil, but unlike the other very complex villains in the show that you are also a part of, no one cares about you. No one gives, to quote a famous YouTuber I watch, one patooey splatoot about you. You choose to commit suicide because you are that desperate to make people suffer because of the way you feel about yourself. And you are treated as a hellishly terrible person. So evil you share the fate of the big bad villain as the only other death in the entire show. Your suicide is not treated as tragic. You are forgotten by everyone you ever loved. You are hated to the bitter end. Is that an ending that fits She-Ra? Heck, is that an ending that fits any show, especially one where the other 2 complex villains get redeemed and united with their loved ones? I'm going to leave that question dangling in the air. I apologize for the length of this video, but I had to get my thoughts out to really express my analysis. The one thing defining Shadow Weaver's entire arc in the season, it's spite. The writers were cruel and merciless with her character, the plot, and the very framing of her actions, and this is a direct result of Noelle's own mindset. I understand that she has a bias against Shadow Weaver due to her own childhood, being raised in an extremely legalistic Christian home. The least she could have done was own up to her bias and have someone else who didn't have the same view as Shadow Weaver handle her arc instead of trying to force an ending that simply no longer worked for her. But with that being said, that's where I'm going to end today's video. In the last video of this series, I'm going to be discussing a summary of what writers can learn from Shadow Weaver's arc. I'm also going to be combining all 6 parts into one long video and putting it on my Writing in the Real World playlist for your viewing pleasure. But for now, thank you for watching and God bless you all.